In ancient Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, stood the fortified city of Eridu. It was a center of irrigation, learning, and power. Its walls were said to reflect the sun like bronze, and its ziggurat pierced the desert horizon. From this cradle of civilization emerged a ruler whose ambition would shape an era, King Naram-Sîn of Akkad. Naram-Sîn was the grandson of Sargon the Great, a name already etched into the clay tablets of history. When he ascended the throne, the empire was vast but fractured. Trade routes trembled under rebellion, and city-states whispered of independence. The young king inherited not only land, but unrest. His rule began with the necessity of consolidation, and his governance soon became synonymous with control. Guys, can you help me to hit 1,000 subscribers on this channel? And it's my dream. Sorry for interruption. It's humble request. Let's jump into the video. From the beginning, Naram-Sîn understood the nature of power in a land of shifting loyalties. He relied on scribes, soldiers, and builders, ensuring every decree was written in cuneiform and enforced by sword. Under his reign, temples multiplied, canals expanded, and merchants flourished. Yet beneath this progress grew fear, for order was maintained through strict obedience. Mesopotamian kings were considered divine intermediaries, but Naram-Sîn went further. He declared himself a god king, a living embodiment of the heavens. He wore the horned crown, a sacred symbol reserved for deities. His portraits and inscriptions showed him towering over soldiers and captives. This self-deification was not merely symbolic. It restructured the social order of Akkad. The priesthood, once central to royal legitimacy, was divided. Some bowed to the new divine image, others resisted in silence. Naram-Sîn saw hesitation as betrayal. His palace became both a court and a tribunal, where judgment was swift and public. The clay tablets that once recorded trade now recorded trials and confessions. The empire's prosperity came with a climate of fear. The king's reforms reached every aspect of daily life. Landowners were taxed to fund fortifications, and farmers worked under supervision. Laborers dug canals not only for crops, but to mark the boundaries of control. Every brick stamped with the royal seal reminded citizens that their work and existence served the god king. Inscriptions from this period speak of monumental architecture, including the expansion of Eridu's temple complex. Thousands of workers toiled in the heat, carrying mud, straw, and clay to construct structures of immense size. To Naram-Sîn, clay was more than material. It was a symbol of creation and endurance. From it, gods had shaped humanity. From it, he would shape obedience. The royal court attracted scholars, astrologers, and craftsmen. They recorded omens, designed statues, and chiseled his victories into stone. The Akkadian armies expanded into Elam and beyond, capturing territories that brought both wealth and resistance. Each conquest was celebrated with new rituals, reinforcing the belief that defying the king was defying divine will. Despite prosperity, murmurs of dissent persisted. The conquered peoples resented forced tributes. Some local governors plotted in secret, hoping to restore their independence. Naram-Sîn viewed rebellion not as political opposition, but as cosmic disobedience. His perception of power was absolute. A rebellion against the king was a rebellion against the gods themselves. Punishments in the Akkadian Empire were severe and symbolic. Law was tied to ritual, and every act of defiance required a public response. Executions were not merely deterrents but messages, carefully staged to reinforce loyalty. The ruler's court became a place where justice and spectacle merged, a theater of submission. Naram-Sîn's advisors often warned him of the limits of fear. They spoke of the value of mercy and compromise, but the king considered leniency a weakness. He saw obedience as sacred duty, not negotiation. His philosophy of rule was shaped by permanence, laws, monuments, and punishments that would outlast generations. His decrees extended beyond the physical realm. Priests composed hymns that praised his divine essence. Poets recorded his victories as celestial acts. Scribes inscribed tablets declaring that Akkad's stability came from the clay of his authority. Within the empire, his name became inseparable from order itself. In foreign territories, his presence was known through tribute and rumor. Traders carried not only goods, but stories of the God King, who demanded offerings of gold and devotion. To neighboring rulers, he was both a rival and a warning. His messengers spoke not of alliances but of surrender. Diplomacy under Naram-Sîn meant submission wrapped in ritual. As his empire reached its height, Naram-Sîn commissioned the construction of ceremonial halls unlike any before. Their walls were lined with reliefs depicting captives, bound and kneeling before his throne. Every figure was carved from clay and hardened in the sun, symbolizing permanence through submission. The clay became a recurring motif, both the foundation of his cities and the substance of his rule. To Naram-Sîn, the subjects of his empire were extensions of his will. Clay was malleable when wet, but unyielding once hardened, a metaphor for his governance. He often reminded his court that a ruler must mold his people before they hardened into rebellion. This philosophy influenced his methods of discipline, which soon evolved into rituals of punishment. The royal artisans began to experiment with new techniques of preservation, seeking ways to immortalize human forms. They molded clay effigies of prisoners and displayed them as warnings. What began as symbolic representation gradually took on literal meaning. The connection between clay control and the human body grew stronger within the walls of Akkad. While the empire appeared invincible, its stability rested on fear and ritual obedience. Every public punishment reinforced the myth of divine justice. Yet within the silence of the temples and the darkness of the workshops, whispers began to spread. Whispers of a new method of punishment, one that would turn the disobedient into monuments of warning. By the end of his third decade on the throne, Naram-Sin's reign stood unmatched in wealth and influence. His clay-sealed archives documented the world's earliest bureaucracy. His armies had subdued countless rivals, and his monuments reached the sky. To his people, he was the ruler who turned dust into empire. To his captives, he was the god who turned men into dust. The king of Akkad had mastered the art of control. His vision of authority was sculpted in clay, sustained by fear and sanctified by ritual. But within this unshakable order, the foundations of something darker were being shaped, a method of punishment that would define the empire's cruelty for centuries to come. The story of the clay thrones was about to begin, born not from rebellion itself, but from a ruler's obsession with permanence, a desire to make disobedience disappear by turning men into the very dust from which they were made. By the middle years of Naram-Sin's reign, Akkad stood as the most formidable empire in Mesopotamia. Its roads carried copper, grain, and lapis lazuli from distant lands, and its temples overflowed with offerings. Yet beneath this wealth lay a growing unease. The farther his armies expanded, the more rebellions arose in the outer provinces. The king, consumed by his divine image, saw disobedience not as human defiance, but as corruption against sacred order. The first mention of the clay punishment appears in a fragmentary tablet unearthed from the palace archives of Eridu. The inscription speaks of those molded before the throne, though its details remain incomplete. Archaeologists believe it described a ritual designed to transform living rebels into symbols of submission, a punishment that merged religion, politics, and fear. Naram-Sin summoned his court priests and artisans to develop a form of execution that would embody his belief in divine permanence. He declared that rebellion was born from impurity, and purity could only be restored through the earth itself. Clay, the sacred substance of creation, would now become the instrument of justice. What had once been used to shape temples and tablets would now reshape the bodies of traitors. Before each ceremony, prisoners were chosen carefully. They were not common thieves or debtors, but governors, officers, and soldiers who had failed in their allegiance. The process began at dawn, when the accused were brought to the central courtyard of the royal temple. The priests read aloud their crimes, not as legal indictments, but as sins against cosmic balance. The king himself presided from his elevated platform, his horned crown glinting in the light. The condemned were stripped of rank and name. Water from the Euphrates was mixed with earth, forming a thick clay paste. Artisans and guards worked side by side, coating the prisoners from feet to neck. Each layer hardened under the heat, sealing their skin and slowing their breath. The priests chanted invocations, claiming that the clay was reclaiming the body for the gods. The punishment was not designed for quick death. The victims were seated upright before the throne, placed in symmetrical rows. As the clay dried, it constricted their lungs and throats. Some suffocated within hours, others lingered longer. To Naram-Sîn, their stillness symbolized restored order. Rebellion turned to immovable silence. Each figure was left on display for several days. The sun baked their coverings into stone-like shells. When the bodies were finally lifeless, artisans covered their faces with thin layers of clay to smooth the surface. Scribes recorded their names, ranks, and offenses on tablets, which were placed beside each hardened body. Together, they formed what became known as the throne line. Visitors to the palace were required to pass between these figures before approaching the king. The sight of human forms turned to dust instilled obedience more effectively than any law. Foreign envoys were made to bow as they walked through, understanding that the same fate awaited those who defied Akkad. The courtyard soon resembled a silent gallery of loyalty and consequence. The ritual gained religious justification through temple hymns. Priests proclaimed that clay was the body of the earth god Enki, and by encasing rebels in it, the king was returning impurity to the divine soil. This interpretation allowed Naram-Sîn to present the practice not as cruelty but as purification. The process became codified into royal law, known as the Decree of Reformation through Earth. The punishment extended beyond rebels. High-ranking officials who failed to meet tribute quotas or falsified records were also subjected to the clay ritual. Inscriptions discovered in later ruins describe entire groups of administrators sealed together during public ceremonies. The punishment became both judicial and ceremonial, reinforcing the unity between state control and religious devotion. Scribes documented the events with precision. Tablets found at Sippar describe one such execution involving 15 men and 3 women accused of aiding insurgents. The victims were seated before the ziggurat, surrounded by chanting priests. As the clay hardened, the crowd watched in silence. No cries were permitted. The king's guards enforced stillness, as sound was believed to offend the gods during purification. Over time, the punishment evolved into architectural symbolism. The hardened figures were incorporated into the foundations of new palaces and temples. Builders placed the clay-covered remains beneath thresholds and stairways, believing that their presence would protect the structures from rebellion. Every step upon the floor became a reminder of loyalty demanded by the throne. The use of clay carried practical meaning as well. In Mesopotamia, clay was abundant and tied deeply to identity. Every record, contract, and law was written upon it. By using the same material to punish defiance, Naram-Sîn unified the symbols of civilization and control. The empire's very foundation was built upon both the written word and the silenced body. Archaeological evidence suggests that special workshops existed for preparing the clay mixture. Tablets describe proportions of water, straw, and ash used to strengthen the coating. This indicates a methodical system, not spontaneous cruelty. The ritual was conducted with precision, aligning with the king's vision of divine order through material discipline. Even among the priesthood, opinions differed. Some saw the practice as an affront to the gods, a misuse of sacred material meant for creation. Others defended it as necessary for maintaining balance in an empire that spanned vast territories. The theological debate remained confined to temple halls, as public dissent risked the same fate as the condemned. By the later years of his reign, Naram-Sîn's courtyard held dozens of clay-seated figures. Some were preserved in alcoves, others were relocated to the entrances of military garrisons. Their faces were smoothed, but faint outlines of human features remained. Dust from their forms mixed with the wind, settling across the city that had once been built from the same earth. Foreign envoys wrote of the spectacle in their own languages, describing the practice as both terrifying and awe-inspiring. To outsiders, it demonstrated the absolute reach of Akkadian authority. To the people of Eridu, it became an accepted reality, an ever-present warning embedded into the architecture of their lives. The ritual of clay marked the height of Naram-Sîn's control. Through it, He merged the elements of punishment, religion, and permanence into a single act. Each execution reaffirmed his divinity, reminding his subjects that he alone could command life and shape destiny. Yet even as the clay figures multiplied, cracks began to appear, not only in the walls of his palaces, but in the loyalty of his subjects. The empire that had been molded by his hands was beginning to dry, just like the clay that encased his victims. What once symbolized unity was slowly becoming a sign of decay. The throne of dust stood firm, but beneath it, the foundations of power were beginning to erode. In the final decade of Naram-Sin's reign, the empire that once stretched from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia began to fracture. Years of drought weakened the farmlands, and trade routes grew unsafe. The same fear that had once sustained obedience now bred silence and resentment. Governors obeyed outwardly but withheld tribute in secret. The clay-seated figures that once stood as warnings now appeared as omens. The ritual that had embodied divine order became its own contradiction. As rebellion spread through the northern provinces, the punishment lost its impact. Soldiers began to desert rather than face the clay courtyard. Inscriptions from later scribes mention that the people called the king he who hardens men, not with reverence but contempt. The clay thrones, once smooth and shining, cracked under the heat and time, their surfaces flaking into dust. Priests who once chanted blessings for the ritual began to question the god-king's divinity. They noted that if the earth was truly sacred, then binding the living to it as punishment was a perversion of balance. In the temple of Eridu, a senior priest reportedly refused to bless the clay mixture, calling it an act of defilement. He was executed the same day, his body sealed in clay before the altar. The punishment symbolism had turned inward. Naram-Sin had built monuments of permanence, but his city was becoming one of decay. Crops failed, trade caravans dwindled, and the empire's borders crumbled under attacks from the Zagros tribes. Yet the king continued to perform the ritual, believing that rebellion stemmed from spiritual impurity rather than human suffering. His final decrees ordered the creation of larger clay thrones, massive seats where entire groups of captives would be sealed together. The last known ceremony took place during the uprising of Kish. Dozens of prisoners accused of conspiring with rebels were coated and placed in a semicircle facing the king's dais. As the clay dried, a sudden sandstorm swept across the courtyard, covering the figures and soldiers alike. Many saw it as an omen, a sign that the gods had turned against the divine king. Soon after, the Gutian tribes invaded from the northeast. The Akkadian army, weakened by years of overreach, collapsed. Eridu was looted and its palaces abandoned. When later rulers entered the ruins, they found the courtyard filled with cracked clay figures, some upright, others broken, their hollow interiors revealing the remains within. The empire that once sought eternity through clay had returned to dust. Naram-Sin's monuments endured only as fragments, his inscriptions buried beneath layers of silt. In the centuries that followed, the clay thrones became a symbol of hubris, the attempt to make obedience eternal through the very substance from which all life was formed. The god-king's legacy, once carved in stone, now survives only as brittle remnants of hardened earth.